I'm sure it's not the seminar, but rather our distinguished speaker that has drawn you all to this room at this time of the afternoon. For the benefit of those who are actually not members of the seminar, let me just say this. The seminar, which has been very kindly financed by the university in order for us to be able to bring distinguished speakers from outside the country, is designed for two purposes. It's a doctoral seminar by the Center of Religious Studies, and as such it does have a seminar agenda and a teaching agenda, and at the same time it is meant to draw larger audiences to each of these sessions, depending on the speakers, on the interests of various members of this university, all of whom are welcome to come and listen and indeed to discuss matters with us. Now, the idea of the seminar actually occurred to us last year as I was deliberating with a number of colleagues from different departments about certain recent developments in the study of religion. And the question of cognitive studies of religion came up. Some of our colleagues are extremely skeptical about any prospects of cognitive study of religion. Others welcome it. And we thought that it would actually repay looking at various topics relating to the junction of three concepts: religion, reason, and nature, right? Religion, reason, and nature. The reason why our first speaker is Professor Lukes is quite simply that in the 1970s and 1980s, there was an extremely lively and very productive debate between anthropologists, philosophers, and others about relativism, rationality, and religion, and culture, indeed. And Stephen Lukes was one of the animating spirits of these meetings, and I had suggested to him that we might like to start by revisiting that particular debate 30 to 40 years hence, after so much bridge has flown after so much water has flown under the bridge, particularly with the advent of cognitive sciences and their incursion into the field of religion, and indeed of the postmodernist turn, of the relativist turn, of the epistemological nihilism, which some of us do associate with this particular turn. So let us see how we stand with respect to that particular debate, and what we might do today with the terms of reference of that debate. Now, there are a number of strands of this particular seminar which connect with that debate. One has to do with the rationality of religion or the irrationality of religion, and another has to do with the rationality or irrationality of approaches to the study of religion. Professor Lukes has offered us a number of readings, has suggested a number of readings to the members of the seminar, which do treat of this question. We have seen in these readings a number of cleavages between studies of context and structure, between scientific and the humanistic. One of the main readings by Laidlaw actually prefers to use the term social science between inverted commas and denies that anthropology, for instance, is a social science. So there are quite a lot of issues that pertain both to the rationality of religion itself and to the rationality or irrationality of studies concerning religion. And I can think of no better guide to initiate these discussions than Professor Lukes. He requires very little introduction. As you probably know already, he is a professor of sociology at New York University, but he had been previously a professor at a variety of other institutions. He had been president of the International Sociological Association. He was a member of the fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg Berlin and of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he is one of the ranking sociologists of today. Professor Lukes. Please.
Thank you so much. It makes me uncomfortable to see people standing up. They have seats here if they want to come to.
Please.
There's some seats here too. Why should people suffer?
Why should people suffer indeed?
There are a couple of seats here. Okay. So it's a great pleasure, needless to say. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's needful to say. It is a real pleasure to be here. When Aziz asked me to do this, I sent him a message saying, well, actually, I didn't really want to talk so much about the rationality debate. I wanted to talk about politics, religion and politics. And so then Aziz sent me a message saying, could we meet halfway? So that's what we're going to do. I actually do want to talk about religion and politics. And in particular, I want to talk about not the question of the place of religion in politics or the extent to which religious justifications or religious thinking should be part of political discourse. I want to talk about the religious analogy, the way in which what illumination thinking about religious political behavior and political attitudes can gain from being thought of in religious terms. But I hope that will become a bit clearer in a minute. That I want to know, in other words, what thinking about politics in terms of a religious analogy, what that can deliver. And so I'm going to talk about the rationality debate in part, and especially in the second part of what I want to say. And I hope that it will interest you. So the question is politics, and in particular democratic politics. I want to know to what extent we can think about politics through using a religious lens. And if I'm going to ask that question, we've got to have some handle on what we mean by religion. So I'm going to start with that. We need a definition of religion. And I realize this is hardly an uncontroversial question. And I need your help here because you're all studying this, and this is something that you've thought a lot about, and doubtless know much more about it than I do. As I see it, there are kind of three different approaches to this. We can either avoid the question, which is what I think Laidlaw does, or we can take two alternative strategies. Now, avoiding the question means that we say, for example, what Laidlaw says in that chapter that I gave you to look at, that there's no it, that religion, that the study of the history of religion is really a study of the changing meanings of the very term religion, and there's no point in, indeed it's a category mistake to try to figure out what there's no definiendum, there's no even explanandum, there's just a series of different historical instantiations of something that we loosely and mistakenly call religion. Well, I'm going to avoid that because that doesn't help with the question I want to ask, namely, to what extent does it help to think about politics as in a religious way, as in some way related, to be understandable as a kind of activity that can be understood in religious terms. So the two alternative ways of thinking about religion that I that I'd like to single out are these. On the one hand, I think we can think about religion in what I call a Durkheimian way. We can take the Durkheimian approach, which is basically to focus on the notion of sacredness, to think about ritual and faith, where what counts as sacred is what any given group or community or society identifies as sacred. Meaning by that, in Durkheim's terms, set apart from ordinary everyday life, immune in some sense from questioning, debate, criticism, as being special in a very particular way, as, for example, inspiring particular kinds of emotion, and as being protected by taboo, where violation of what is held to be sacred is seen as sacrilege. But the content of what counts as religious here, what's treated as sacred, is left entirely open. That's one approach, which has a whole history of subsequent exemplars of this way of understanding religion, in which the content of belief is not considered part of the definition. It's not what we mean by religion. So that, for example, and I'll come to this in a minute, you can have political religions, you can have secular religion. The second approach is something which I think was foreshadowed in some way in the rationality debate, which Aziz referred to, but which has been very much taken up by the cognitive science of religion, about which many of you will know more than I do, and in particular, I'm very glad that Dan Sperber is here because he's one of the central figures in that, and was indeed a central figure in this rationality debate to which Aziz just referred. And the second approach starts, and I'm here quoting from one of the exponents of the cognitive science of religion, from the common sense observation that religion seems to center on beliefs about supernatural or superhuman beings, but substituting for superhuman and supernatural, counterintuitive. So in this sense, on the second approach, religion is a set of thoughts, behaviors, and experiences involving counterintuitive representations. Now, what I want to do for the bulk of what I'm going to say now is basically take these two ways of thinking about religion, one first and then the second, and then apply them to the question that really interests me, which is, well, what does this tell us about politics? In particular, what does this tell us about politics, and in particular democratic politics today? And I have to say, I have been very much influenced in thinking about this and preparing this lecture by what's happening actually tomorrow in the country in which I live, namely the inauguration of President Trump, and also the experience, I speak as a Brit, of Brexit. I mean, we live at a time, I think, where these questions seem to me to be ever more pressing and troubling. So, getting back to the question of religion and what we mean by it, and these two approaches, the Durkheimian approach and let's call it the counterintuitive approach. First of all, the Durkheimian approach. Well, let me start with a quotation from Durkheim. It's a question that he asks. And it's a question that he asks towards the end of the Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He asks, what difference is there between an assembly of Christians celebrating the principal dates of the life of Christ, or of Jews remembering the Exodus from Egypt, or the promulgation of the Decalogue, on the one hand, and a reunion of citizens commemorating the promulgation of a new moral or legal system, or some great event in the national life? What essential difference is there, Durkheim asks. In asking this, he is actually not too far from Rousseau, who, when he wrote about civil religion in the last chapter of The Social Contract, talks about the need for civil religion to mobilize social sentiments. And Rousseau says, without this, a man cannot be a good citizen or a faithful subject. And the dogmas of this civil religion, he says, ought to be few, simple, and easily worded, without explanation or commentary. So, for Durkheim and for Rousseau, there's this idea that religion can be civil, can be secular, that a democratic society requires that to function well. And so here, the very idea of a religion being secular and being political is regarded as completely understandable and indeed desirable. And that actually Durkheim put to work and made a specific or concrete sense of at the time of the Dreyfus affair, when, as a very strong Dreyfusard, he, Durkheim, took on the anti-Dreyfusards, the upholders, the supporters of the church and the army, in a famous article which had a lot of impact at the time called Individualism and the Intellectuals, in which he, Durkheim, said, society is basically becoming ever more heterogeneous and lacking in a sense of, let's say, national unity, except for what it is that unites us, meaning by us, we Frenchmen, and that is, he said, the religion of the individual, the cult of man, of which the individual is both God and believer and God, and whose central dogma is autonomy of reason, whose central rite or ritual is freedom of thought. So he's playing there a very ingenious sort of rhetorical trick by saying that the anti-Dreyfusards who were saying were justifying, were proclaiming the case against Dreyfus to be an essential part of national unity, that you should never question the judgment of the military court because that would be anti-patriotic. Durkheim is saying, on the contrary, what unites us is this belief in the sacredness of the individual. And so that was Durkheim's own attempt, which was rhetorically, I think, pretty effective, but as an argument, pretty questionable, to make sense of, to defend the case for liberal, kind of liberal democratic unity of society as a basis for national cohesion. And that argument you can see as a formulation, or one of the various formulations of a case for civil religion. And that's been taken up by several thinkers. I mean, in one of the readings that I distributed or suggested you might look at, there was a whole series of what I call neo-Durkheimian arguments, in which, by various thinkers, various sociologists in the 1960s, 50s, writing about, let's say, the British coronation, and then there was a discussion, for example, of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, in which it was proclaimed, yes, this is what unites us, this belief in, liberal values held to be sacred. And now this way of connecting religion in the Durkheimian way, the sacredness of something, let's say, liberal values, or the idea of the individual's rights as being sacred. This particular way of thinking, I think, actually doesn't work very well. And I think this was put very well by Jan Werner Müller in his recent book on populism, where he talks about this idea. And he says, and I'm quoting now, veneration of symbols such as flags, national anthems, pledges of allegiance, ceremonies at statesmen's tombs, constitution days, even battleships named after the Constitution. This, then, is the stuff of civil religion, in which religion is ultimately a metaphor for the process of creating and reinforcing the symbolic power of constitutions. But he says it's just a metaphor. It's not real. It's like a kind of simulacrum of religion, a more or less metaphorical invocation of concepts, dispositions, and behaviors associated commonly with religion, and a transference of them to political objects. So I don't think that this particular way of thinking, this idea of a civil religion, makes much sense, either as a description of the way religion works in politics or in democratic politics, or indeed as an aspiration, as an idea of a normative ideal of how a good liberal society, the liberal democratic society, should function. But what I do think, and I'm going to come to this in a minute, is that there is something there that requires and deserves deeper thought, namely the idea of the role of sacredness in political life, and the idea that the holding of certain things as being set apart beyond discussion, as not subject to critical scrutiny, is at work in political life, not only in non-democratic societies, but in liberal democratic ones, increasingly, I think. And this, I think, should trouble us. Just as an indication of what I have in mind, if you compare the United States and Europe, I think one can make two comparisons that go in a way in opposite directions. On the one hand, you have, for example, the issue of Holocaust denial and the idea that there are some things which really are just not acceptable and indeed are legally punishable in the public domain. An idea which exists, for example, in France and Germany and Austria, where, for example, denial of the Holocaust is actually a punishable offense, whereas in the United States you have the opposite idea that everything that doesn't represent a clear and present danger is subject to political discussion and legal. On the other hand, you have the phenomenon of political correctness, where, and here I want to quote something from what I wrote, that the idea that some things are immune to discussion is it's built into the assumptions that people make. Let's see. In the United States, this has turned out to be a source of serious conflict and resentment in the recent U.S. election. It was effectively used by Donald Trump to rally supporters on the basis that matters important to people were excluded from open discussion and debate, that even to raise them was to invite being stigmatized, and note that religious term, as being racist and bigoted. So the idea that some things were just to be held immune and set apart, immune from debate and discussion, was something that many liberals, I guess myself among them, thought, well, that was as it should be. So in a recent, very interesting book by Arlie Hochschild based on ethnographic work in Louisiana, she wrote, "It was with joyous relief that many people who then became Trump voters heard a Donald Trump who seemed to be wildly, omnipotently, magically free of all politically correct constraints. This giddy, validating release produced a kind of high that felt good. And of course, people wanted to feel good. The desire to hold on to this elation became a matter of emotional self-interest. And the problem was, and is, that many of them, those who held these views, are racist and bigoted, but that calling them so only aggravated the situation. So it can be argued that the divisiveness of the current politics of European societies in the United States can only be addressed by mutual engagement, by crossing what Hochschild calls the empathy wall and exercising what John Muller calls the democratic duty of reasoning, of engaging in reason-giving. So that's some indication, I hope, of where I think this idea of sacredness is at work in politics, in liberal democratic politics. Now, I want to move from those maybe rather scattered suggestions to the other way of thinking about religion, which is what I call the counterintuitive approach, which is, I guess, the approach that's central to the cognitive science of religion. Now here, what counts as religion starts from, as I understand it, a sense that there's something cognitively suspect, subject to criticism, subject to cognitive suspicion, that requires explanation. So going back to the rationality debate, and here I'm going to come to it, that idea, the idea of what you might call asymmetric explanation, I think is where the cognitive science of religion kind of starts. It's this idea that there's something to explain here. And what the Edinburgh School, people like Barry Barnes and David Bloor, argued was you shouldn't do that. You should explain everything in the same way. But I think they were wrong about this. I think that if there is something cognitively puzzling about a set of beliefs, that's something further to explain. You have a puzzle here that you need an explanation for. And so what we argued there was that rationality, that failures of rationality required explanation. That was a kind of beginning. And one way in which that was articulated, again, to go back to rationality debate, was by Robin Horton, who made this very interesting distinction between what he called primary theory and secondary theory. Primary theory is basically the common sense apprehension or understanding of the world of everyday life, physical and biological and interpersonal apprehension that is kind of pan-human. And then the vast proliferation of what he called secondary theory, which is where you depart from this in all kinds of fascinating ways which absorb people and come to govern their lives, where you have massive diversity and incompatibilities and incommensurable differences across cultures. And that's, it seems to me, at the heart of this development of cognitive science of religion, where to make the same distinction, to use Dan Sperber's distinction, between intuitive and counterintuitive, or I think you said intuitive and reflective belief, where the whole idea of what's religious is that it's a particular domain of counterintuitive beliefs which catch hold and spread. Now, here I'm just going to quote a little bit from Dan, actually, if he doesn't mind, where he talks about. Now, this was a very important early contribution to the rationality debate in our book, Rationality Relativism, by Dan, which is a paper called Apparently Irrational Beliefs, where he used this very interesting concept, which I think you then moved on from, semi-propositional attitudes, or semi-propositional representations, where he says, our capacity to form these gives us the means to process information, that's in this early paper, and in particular verbal information, which exceeds our conceptual capacities. And we then so engage in evocative and symbolic thinking, where there's no fixed interpretation, where there's no way of determining what the correct answer is. An example being, for example, the belief that God is everywhere, which don't lend themselves, Dan then wrote, to a final clear interpretation, and will therefore never become intuitive. Indeed, part of the interest of religious beliefs for those who hold them comes precisely from this element of mystery, from the fact that you are never through interpreting them. Religious beliefs are half understood or mysterious, and therefore open to reinterpretation. So their consistency or inconsistency with other beliefs, intuitive or reflective, is never self-evident and doesn't provide a robust criterion for acceptance or rejection. Their content, however, because of indeterminacy, cannot be sufficiently evidenced or argued for to warrant its rational acceptance, but that doesn't make these beliefs irrational, for they are rationally held if there are rational grounds to trust the source of the belief. So the source of the belief is what makes them rational. And here, therefore, the rationality isn't direct, it's indirect, it's based upon authority. So the believer has a reason to trust the belief source, which can be a holy book or an oracle, or a communicator, say a prophet or a priest, or revelation or tradition, and so on. Now, so religion on this account becomes a set of thoughts, behavior, and experience involving counterintuitive representations, where, and this, I guess, is also the idea of Pascal Boyer, who maybe was the originator of all of this, in which there is a contrast between, or rather, what makes them counterintuitive is that they contradict pan-human intuitive expectations about how various entities behave. So a person without a body, or surviving death, or subject to divine inspiration, or let's say walking on water, or performing miracles, or a statue that hears prayers, and so on and so on. So religion then becomes the counterintuitive. Counterintuitive representations are religious because they're, and here's another quotation from, how do you say it, Pysyanin? How do you say that? How do you say
I can't for the life of me
pronounce. P-Y-Y-S, how do you say it?
I'm not sure whether that's the right pronunciation.
I don't know how to say. Anyway, he's a Finnish exponent of the cognitive theory of religion. He writes, counterintuitive representations are religious when they're cherished by a group of people who, when people have an emotional attitude towards them, use them in their life management and take them seriously, and where the important thing is they're not mere metaphors, but are taken to reveal important forces and beings whose nature can't be understood by natural intuition. Often they're seen as capable of, as agents, capable of intervening in human lives, and their exact nature is considered to be beyond the reach of perceptual and imaginative abilities. Now, what I've done up to now is basically sketch two ways of thinking about religion. Religion as sacred, as a kind of sacredness, where something or some value or some set of practices or something which is valued is held apart from, set apart from, immune to questioning, discussion, criticism. Or secondly, a way of thinking about religion where the content is specified in this formal way as being a whole vast range of ways in which our intuitive apprehension of the world is counteracted in one or another way. We engage in counterintuitive thinking and practice based upon it. Now let me come to the few things I want to say about politics and the question whether either or even both of these ways of thinking about what religion is at work in our politics, and in particular in liberal democratic politics. And now I want to refer to a book which you may or may not know. I didn't include it in the reading list, but it seems to me to be a book of extremely great interest, published recently in the United States by the authors being Larry Bartels and Christopher Hitchens, and it's called Democracy for Realists. And it's a kind of explosive book. At any rate, it's a book which is deeply skeptical of the idea of the rational voter and the role of rationality in politics. Politics, you might think, there are two very common ways of thinking, the political theorists or political scientists think about politics. You can think about politics as a sphere in which people are basically in pursuit of their interests, maybe more or less rationally, in the sense that people make all kinds of mistakes, they don't think straight, they get things wrong, but basically they're in pursuit of their interests. And that's how to think about politics. Or a second way is to think in the way in which, for example, Habermas does, and in a much more normative manner, in terms of a sphere of public reason, roles as well, where you think about politics as a place where people are engaging, however imperfectly, however incompetently, but nevertheless, in principle, it's a sphere of reason-giving, of debate, of discussion, of trying to figure out what is the best way to run a common space, a common society. And so my question is to what extent is it going to be helpful to think about politics in a third way, that's to say, as a place where people are behaving, thinking and acting in something like a religious manner? So let me now tell you, first of all, what Aitken and Bartels have to say about politics. They begin by telling us about something they call the folk theory of democracy. So what's that? The folk theory of democracy, they say, is the idea that democracy begins with the voters, that ordinary people have preferences as to what their governments should do, that they choose leaders who will do these things or enact their preferences directly in referendums. In either case, what the majority wants becomes government policy, a highly attractive prospect in light of most human experience with governments. Democracy makes the people the rulers, and legitimacy derives from their consent. Now, this set of ideas, they say, has passed into everyday wisdom, not just in the United States, but in a great many other countries across the globe. Moreover, it's been accepted by much of the best of contemporary political theory. So you've got this very prominent strands of participatory or deliberative democracy, where the idea is rationally mutual consideration, patient exchange of publicly justified reasons for supporting specific policies. Well, much of the rest of their book, consists in exploding this, shall we call it myth? They call it a myth. They think, in other words, that these expectations are wildly unrealistic. The ideal of popular sovereignty plays much the same role, they write, and this borders on the theme I'm trying to get to here. Much the same role, they suggest, in contemporary democratic ideology that the divine right of kings played in the monarchical era. In a quasi-religious commitment, they say, it's a fiction providing legitimacy and stability to political systems whose actual workings are manifestly and inevitably rather less than divine. The fiction feels natural within the Enlightenment mindset of rationality and human perfectibility. Thoughtful people and important scholars believe it, and its credibility is bolstered by the undeniable practical successes of many of the regimes which adhere to it and invoke it. But this cause, they claim, empirically based and overwhelming, to be skeptical. They quote Walter Lippmann, a notoriously elitist thinker, in 1922 observing, "The real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. We're not equipped to deal with so much subtlety, so much complexity, so much variety, so many permutations and combinations. And although we have to act in that environment, we have to reconstruct it on a simple model before we can manage it." In the 1960s, 70s, and I actually, the first article I ever wrote was about this. There were various political scientists who were very effective in showing, and I'm quoting now from two of them, how relatively invulnerable to direct argumentation voters are. Their voting being characterized more by faith than by conviction, by wishful expectation rather than careful prediction of consequences. Many citizens, another one wrote, do not have meaningful beliefs, even on issues that have formed the basis for intense political controversy among elites for substantial periods of time. Things haven't changed. Bartels and Aitken, these two authors I've just referred to, they cite one contemporary scholar writing that people know jaw-droppingly little about politics. And they summarize the various findings of present-day research in their book as follows. Most democratic systems are uninterested in politics, poorly informed, unwilling to or unable to convey coherent policy preferences through issue voting. Perhaps now you begin to see the connections I was making with Brexit and the recent US election. Nor, they add, by the way, are voters any better at what's called retrospective voting. That is to say, where, which, by the way, obviously demands much less of voters than the other view, that issue voting, prospective issue voting. They say, assessing responsibility for what politicians have done, people are very bad at it, at even assessing their own welfare. For instance, voters punish incumbent politicians for changes in their welfare that are clearly acts of God or nature. And they're poor judges of assigning credit and blame. Retrospection is blind and, or at the very best, extremely myopic. The retrospective theory of voting asks too much of ordinary people. They can't meet its demands, and the result is capricious judgments at election time. Nor do the various experiments, by the way, in direct democracy, and here I'm thinking of direct primaries, citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, and of plebiscitary referendums, of course, they don't offer any basis for concluding otherwise. What all these forms of political practice deliver is, I'm quoting again, a mishmash of heightened responsiveness to popular impulses, behind-the-scenes elite influence, self-defeating choices stemming from limited political experience and attention of ordinary citizens. And this isn't just true of United States voters. For instance, and I found this particularly striking, it turns out that in France, the very home of ideological politics and of the very distinction between left and right, majority of voters didn't understand the difference. So how are we to understand how democratic citizens make their electoral choices? These authors answer, and they claim this to be based in political psychology and produce a massive evidence. They argue that the folk theory that I've just outlined, which focuses on either prospective issue voting or retrospective judgments of how politicians have behaved, that this doesn't work, and that actually their positive suggestion is that people are voting on group attachments or what they call identities, which they claim are emotional attachments that transcend thinking. And here's a summary of their alternative view. Real people are not much like the citizens imagined by the folk theory. Numerous studies have demonstrated that most residents of democratic countries have little interest in politics, don't follow news of public affairs beyond browsing the headlines, don't know the details of even salient policy debates, don't have a firm understanding of what the political parties stand for, and often vote for parties whose long-standing issues and positions are at odds with their own. Mostly they identify with ethnic, racial, occupational, religious, or other sorts of groups, and often, whether through group ties or hereditary loyalties, with a political party. Even the most attentive citizens mostly adopt the positions of the parties as their own. And this, by the way, was very much the case in the recent US election. And they're mirrors of the parties, not masters. Most citizens, most of the time, party and group loyalties are the primary drivers of voter choice. Now, I happen to think that the concept of identity is pretty useless as an explanatory tool. I don't like it. I have always said whenever a student says to me, starts talking about identity, I say, can you say this in other words? But there's something there, and I'm wondering whether religion might be a key. For one thing, I mean, just to say one thing about identity, it's entirely ambivalent, the concept of identity, on the question of agency. I mean, is my identity determinate or indeterminate? Solid or fluid? Given or subject to choice? Fixed or invented? So I want to conclude what I've got to say now by suggesting that the religious analogy might help us, I'm not sure, but this is a question for you, get us beyond the unhelpful notion of identity to focus on the motivations and mindsets of democratic citizens, and indeed, beyond that, where the threats and dangers lie to a functioning democracy. Let's assume that Aitken and Bartels, these authors of the book Democracy for Realists, let's assume they're right about the overwhelming importance of group affiliations in explaining people's voting choices. And let's assume their evidence and argumentation is very convincing. I happen to think it is. I think we need to ask how this connection works. What's the mechanism? And my thought is that it works in the two main ways suggested by the two ways I've sketched in defining how religion works. First, let's take this folk theory of democracy, this lay version of what Enlightenment thinkers from, let's say, Condorcet to Habermas have theorized. This assumes democratic citizens are able to formulate policy preferences, that they assess where the candidates stand on the basis of the issues. They set aside cognitive biases and group prejudices, and then they choose a candidate who embodies an uplifting version of their own policy view, or at least they retrospectively reward and punish candidates accordingly. Now, what about the thought that instead they treat their views as sacred, demarcated as immune to questioning or even comparison with others? And by the way, that's what I think sacredness, I didn't say this before, it captures not just the idea that some things are fundamentally important and more important than anything else. They actually reject the very idea of the comparison. I mean, that I think, by the way, is the difference between sacrifice and a trade-off. A trade-off is where you say such and such is more important than something else. It could even be forever more important. It could be absolutely more important. But sacrifice is this further idea that the very comparison is legitimate. So I would suggest. Now, I think that the question is, to what extent is the very idea of sacredness, as the Durkheimian view would predict, this would be linked with group affiliation. So the idea that people not only demarcate, but also are bound by their commitments to a particular group or community, and indeed, it doesn't just bind them, but it blinds them, this sacredness, to what might be said for other views. So, in Rousseau's words, which I quoted before, they're like religious dogmas, to quote Rousseau's words, few, simple, and easily worded without explanation or commentary. So the folk theory fails as a description. Political positions and policy views in general mirror especially party affiliations, and this applies equally to the poorly and to the highly educated. Now, at this point, my argument becomes, how shall I say, uncomfortable, because if you start applying this to yourself and start reckoning that this applies not just to the less educated, but also to the highly educated and engaged, the argument becomes an uncomfortable one to make. As Aitken and Bartels themselves comment, the political beliefs of more attentive, knowledgeable citizens are often more subject to partisan bias than those of their less attentive neighbours. And the highly engaged even develop ideological frameworks rationalising their group loyalties and denigrating those of their political opponents. So then we can ask, and this is where I'm going to conclude, does the folk theory's failure as a description, does it rule out taking it on as a normative ideal? Is the rational voter a fantasy? Now that depends on assessing what's feasible. Applying the religious analogy to voters, now we move to the counterintuitive theory. If, as the counterintuitive theory of how religions work suggests, the policy views of most ordinary democratic citizens are going to be based on an inevitably inadequate understanding of issues that are, for the most part, far removed from the intuitive knowledge by which people live their everyday lives, and are therefore beyond the reach of their perceptual and imaginative abilities, then the prospects don't look good. Of course, where particular policies actually directly touch people's lives, such as, for instance, in America, abortion, what we find is that people may have clear policy views that in turn influence how they vote. So, in this case, for example, women are more likely to change their party vote than their abortion views, whereas men, when their abortion views and party loyalties conflict, are more likely to change their abortion views. That's one of the findings in this book by Akin and Bartels. What the current wave of populism sweeping across the Western world portends, I fear, is the rise of such counterintuitive thinking akin to religion. Populists, such as, dare I say it, Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, speak and act in the name of what? An imagined entity, the people, seen as fully unified and morally pure, unconstrained by the need for empirical evidence or logical consistency, leaving ample scope for interpreting what policies of the people, as distinct from corrupt elites and enemies of the people, demand. Here the people is no mere metaphor, but is seen as an important force and being whose nature can't be understood by natural intuition, but is nevertheless believed to exist and act. And on that really rather grim note, I'm going to come to an end.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. This is a constellation of connected reflections, wonderfully textured.
Thank you.
In very complex ways. And you end, I would restate your conclusion. I would say that you're suggesting that the analogy between post-factualism and religious belief and the irrationality of religious belief is, in fact, a regression to a prefactual world, as it were, to a prefactual world, given the fact that we have had 200 years of modernist transformations in which there was a certain emphasis on verifiability, right, across public life. So it's a regression in a very real sense. From a civic religion to something which is far more archaic. But of course, I thought that you were suggesting that with regard to the situation arising with Trump, for instance, we have a disenchantment of the political, which leads also to a re-enchantment of some other register, which becomes indeed more relevant in forming the political process and in producing political outcomes. That is at least what I would infer. I do have a number of questions that I'd like to raise, but before I do so, I'd like to have a first sampling of questions and reactions from the audience. Please, who would like to chip in first? Dan.
Yeah, well, Stephen, I found that very suggesting, but I will take exception to the way you've been using the cognitive and what you call counter-intuitive approach. I think again, it gave me new ideas listening to you, but I think they should be developed somewhat differently from the way you do. So just to, there were two ideas in the cognitive approach as it was developed in the early 80s. One was that if you understand some content of belief or practice only partially, if you have a partial understanding, you may just ignore it. But if you start to reject it or to adopt it, it's not going to be on the basis of a content which you fail to understand, but on the basis of an authority
Of an authority.
Of an authority which tells its right or wrong. And the claim was that in particular religious ideas, not only them, but them will easily spread on the basis of authority and not in spite of their mysteriousness, but because of it, which precisely makes us unable, makes the believer unable to judge them on their content.
Right.
Then the next step was to say that's not enough because there are so many obscure ideas that do spread and not all religious. So what's more specific of religious idea was the idea that indeed they don't just depart for common sense understanding, they go straight against it, they are counterintuitive. And Pascal Boyer added that point, and Pascal added the point that they're not just counterintuitive, they're minimally counterintuitive. There are things which are highly understandable, except from one element, central element, which makes them, so you have supernatural agents to which you can apply your understanding of agents in general, except they have supernatural powers which make them mysterious. So when you're trying to, so these are two different things. Obscurity or mysteriousness plus authority is one element of explanation. Counterintuitiveness is a factor of explanation of a particular success of religious ideas.
Yeah.
And it's been overblown, not by Pascal Boyer, but by a number of both his critics and his followers, as a general theory of religion, which is not the way he intended it at all. Now, when you come to the comparison with politics, the same argument can be made, and I hear you as making it, that one important factor is that many political ideas, commitments, practices, and so on are accepted or rejected while not being properly understood because of their indeed mysterious obscurity for the people who vote or take part in different ways. But the reason why they never, in spite of them being obscure, they succeed socially in communities may have to. I would suggest, listening to you, it came to me. It's not because they're counterintuitive. They're not. In that, they're really different from. You get quite a bit of overlap, but they're not counterintuitive. What they are relative to ordinary intuitions are hyperbolic forms. So we have intuitions about identity. What you get when you get indeed sacred identities, the nation, it becomes a kind of hard to understand notion. There's something that can be forever interpreted, not because it's counterintuitive, because it's an hyperbolic, exaggerated, hyperstimulus version of the intuitive sense we have of social identity. Same thing with liberty, same thing with a number of things which are central to this apparently rational political commitments. All part of the success, again, it's not a general explanation of why such irrational political ideas succeed. Part of it to the obscurity, but not to the counterintuitiveness, but to another kind of relationship we have to intuition, which is to exaggerate it beyond intelligibility.
Would you like to elaborate on the distinction, which I think is being suggested between the hyperbolic and the sort of sacred counterintuitive?
Yeah, I'm trying to think through that distinction, the distinction between counterintuitive and exaggerated or hyperbolic. Is it really so clear a distinction?
No, it's not a clean distinction, and again, there's a lot of overlap. But it's part of the intuitions that human social agents bring to social life. They expect hierarchy, they accept leaders, they accept in-groups, out-groups relationship, a number of things. But when you get a kind of supreme leader, which in many historical circumstances, like the Roman Empire, can be transformed into a god. When you get the nation, which becomes not just an in-group, but something for which indeed one ought to sacrifice one's life, and so on. So then what you get is not something that goes against the intuition as being able to be ubiquitous or immortal, goes again intuition about biological organisms. It just takes the intuition and just blows it up to the degree where suddenly you don't, instead of being a source of understanding, it becomes a source of mysteriousness where you have indeed to rely on authority to accept it or reject it.
Yeah. I will need to think some more about this. It seems to me there is a distinction there. I agree. But when we talk, about, let's say, nations acting, when we talk about What you're saying is basically you can have a charismatic leader, but once the charismatic leader himself becomes a god, you've moved from hyperbole to counterintuition.
Yeah, because now suddenly he or she is immortal and all that, and so now you're violating intuitions about biological common sense and so on. But when you just go from assuming that there is a head of our group who should be obeyed, who is very wiser than others, to the idea that it's super. Indeed, it's a kind of wisdom and competence that go way beyond what you can even comprehend.
But the point where I guess that becomes the distinction becomes fuzzy and becomes less clear cut is where, for example, captured by the notion of charisma. The idea, in other words, that the leader is divinely inspired. So in some way, the prophet is a figure. That's where the two come. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose in a ritual setting, one may then introduce a parallel distinction between veneration and worship. Let us take, for instance, two objects. Right. The cross and the chalice. Mm-hmm. One venerates the chalice, but one worships the cross. Yeah. Right? One does not necessarily, one does not, in fact, worship the chalice. Yeah. So I think this is really quite a fruitful distinction, because really it does impact. It does have an impact on the way in which many of us search around for proper definitions of what might constitute the sacred. And of course, you pose the question of whether the notion of civil religion might really designate a religion or just a simulacrum.
Is it a metaphor?
Or a metaphor of religion. And the same would apply to, of course, to Robert Bellah. This very important article by Robert Bellah on civic religion in America. Is it actually a religion, or is it a cultural form which incorporates certain elements which are normally associated with religions, right? Rather than actually constituting religion as such. Yeah. If, of course, we understand by religion not an entity which is very clearly defined, but for the sake of argument, for the sake of simplicity, a system of family resemblance, right? With a number of features which are normally associated with it, and defined ostensibly, as lawyers would say, that is to say, by recognition. I recognize this as a religion, as it were, rather than rigorously defining.
There are several questions here. I mean, one is, are we talking about a distinction that's a distinction made by the actors, or is it an external distinction? Is it ethic or emic?
It's certainly ethic. In this distinction, I think we as analysts, what you were suggesting rather provocatively is that in essential ways politics and religion share more than what is already recognized.
Yes, that's what it is.
And I was suggesting that you hadn't quite made the case, and the very argument you were using could remain roughly consistent with your goal, but deployed differently by precisely saying, lumping everything under counterintuitive misses in various ways in which authority can take hold of.
I think this is really helpful what you're saying, but I think especially helpful when you raise the question which I tried to do just now of whether it is in the end a clear or not, a distinction or not, and if it's not, where it's not clear is really interesting. Yeah.
Please, Al.
Thank you very much. As usual, your insights are very inspiring, provocative. I take a somewhat different point of view because I'm not a philosopher, I'm not an intellectual historian, I'm a social political historian. But what you said about the value of regarding politics, particularly in the Western world right now, in the light of certain artifacts of religious belief, seems to me to raise a very interesting question. Would you agree to the proposition that the crisis is largely due in the Western world, particularly in the United States today, is due to the fact that what seemed to be a homogeneous secular religion is coming apart at the seams because different objects and beliefs are held as sacred by different parts of the population.
Yeah.
So that while the Constitution is a sacred body of belief, it is interpreted. And the interpretations of it have now become such that 2 or 3 or more sacred items within it are in conflict.
And given contradictory interpretations,
Yes.
yeah. Even though it says we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Well,
Yes,
that's the Declaration of Independence,
Right.
which of course is itself contradictory to the Constitution.
Okay.
Because the Declaration says all men are created equal, but the Constitution held slavery
Right.
in its original design. So we've always, I think, faced this problem in the United States, and I think it's now being faced in other countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just let me make a footnote in when I've tried in my own work to apply what we call political theology, one of the reasons that I found that the great empires were ultimately undermined and destroyed from within, or weakened to the point where external blows could destroy them from without,
Mm-hmm.
was due to the fact that the sacredness of the of rule was undermined by the rationality of Western influences.
So I didn't hear the rationality of...
The rationality of Western philosophical thinking undermined the sacred ideals that were held by the elites. But that's just a footnote.
It may be a footnote, but it's intensely interesting. Can you give an example?
Well, I've written a book about it.
Yeah.
It's in a book called The Struggle Over the Eurasian Borderlands.
Uh-huh.
And my example is drawn from Russia, the Ottoman Empire,
Oh, right.
Habsburg monarchy, Iran, and China.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat overly ambitious, perhaps, but that's one of the main theses of the book.
Yeah. So sacredness gets undermined by rationality, by Western rationality, you said.
Such as the deification of the ruler,
Ah,
the established church,
I see.
the values that govern obedience and controls within
Yeah.
society as being imposed
Yeah.
and sacred
Yeah.
set of practices. These are undermined as Western education enters with technological
Yeah, I see.
order, eroding these intuitive, if you will.
I'd love to read your book. I will. But just you see, what's really disturbing me, as he's noted, is that seems to me to be at work, and not just now, in Western liberal democracies. The idea of sacredness being at work in places which the so-called folk theory really denies.
Well, the American Civil War is a perfect example
Right.
of this clash between sacred objects.
No, but we don't like to think it's happening now, and I think it is.
Well, that's the tragedy.
Yes, please.
So contemporary politics is characterized by high level of volatility.
Of what?
Volatility.
Mm-hmm.
So citizens move from one political camp to another one. They rebel against their own leaders, misbehave in general. So I wonder, how do you square this high degree of volatility and flexibility with your idea that political behavior is comparable to religious behavior?
Well, actually, with respect, it's not true. I mean, volatility is not a general feature of the voter behavior, for example, in the United States, which I know best, because actually voting patterns are very stable. What the volatility is between voting and not voting. For the most part, the so-called volatile, if you mean by that independent voters who switch from party to party, it turns out, and it's been so for a very long time, that the least constant voters are the least well-informed. They're the least competent.
Electoral volatility has increased from 8% to 17% in Europe in the last 15, 20 years.
In Europe?
Yes.
Do you mean by volatility switching between parties?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that, of course, that has to do with the breakdown of parties as well, doesn't it? I mean, that has to do with what's happening at the level of party organizations and party survival. So the collapse of Christian democratic parties, the collapse of communist parties, the fragmentation of parties is largely an explanation for that, I think.
May I ask you for a position on the opposition which is put forward between explanation from the outside and interpretation from within, the subject position, as it were?
Mm-hmm.
May I ask you for a position? Because I mean, it does have a very clear connection with the debate, the earlier debates on rationality and relativism, with the rise and expansion of postmodern social sciences and post-colonial analyses, and these issues that we are discussing today, right? And of course, the article, that chapter by Laidlaw is very explicit and quite broad-ranging in that particular respect.
Yes, but you've asked me a very general question about the difference between what's really ethic-emic concept.
Let me make it more specific. We're running out of time. I don't know if any of you have seen this article by Bruno Latour on Ramses II.
On which?
Ramses II.
Okay, no. I haven't seen
The mummy of Ramses II was taken to Paris for study in 1998. And after anatomical and bacteriological studies, it was decided that he probably died of tuberculosis. That he had probably died of tuberculosis 3,000 years ago. Now, Latour argues that since the notion of tuberculosis was not available to them 1000 BC, we cannot really assert that he died of tuberculosis.
Well, my first reaction to that is ridiculous. That is a ridiculous assertion.
It's very interesting.
I mean, why should the fact that a diagnosis was not available to the actors mean that?
No, he said this would be just as anachronistic as asserting that he died because of stress induced by the fall in the stock exchange.
No, but I don't know how interesting. I don't know how interesting as it is to discuss this example. What I think is much more interesting is the sort of case raised by Ian Hacking, for instance.
Yes.
Whether you could say child abuse existed before child abuse was conceptualized.
Yes.
I mean, that's a much more, I think, gripping. I haven't read this. I'm surprised that Bruno Latour, I mean, it strikes me as a singularly stupid example. I mean, maybe there's a better, maybe there's more to it than you're saying. But,
I don't think so. I mean, it's short. It can be read very quickly and very thoroughly. And
no, but the child abuse example is interesting because there you actually have a social process.
There you have a social process and social perceptions.
Where the description of the phenomenon is actually part of the causal process itself. So, in other words, and this whole idea of feedback loops, which he develops, Hacking. So, to say that child abuse existed before the very concept of child abuse, you can say it, but it carries much less conviction.
Indeed. Yes. No, the only reason I bring this up is because it's referred to and lauded by Laidlaw.
Oh, I see.
I hadn't been aware of it before that.
But in general, I think that how actors understand the world and how it... I mean, I don't... And this was part of the rationality debate. I think that there's no reason to just assume, as Peter Winch did, for instance, that explanation must involve in some way reproducing the actor's self-understanding. But
this has become a predominant trope.
Well, I mean, as far as this issue goes, I'm with Evans Pritchard. I think I love the last 2 pages of the book on witchcraft, oracles, and magic among the Azandi, where he asks the question, how come the Zandi were unable to see the errors of their beliefs? And he gives 22 answers.
Errors. Yes, please. Last question.
Thank you. So as I listened to the talk, in the last, after you outlined the Durkheimian and one of these cognitive scientific premisses, it seemed in the last third to me that your working definition of religion was really a hybrid of these two. Now, I don't know if that's what you intended, but that's kind of what I heard.
You mean I was combining the two?
Yes, well, you were comparing the two, but as you were talking about politics, it seemed like at one time you were drawing from one or another. So it seemed like you had a working definition of religion that included notions of the sacred, whether those include something non-sacred or secular, like Durkheim.
Yeah.
Something that may or may not be counterintuitive, which is drawn from cognitive science. And then I think this was your own contribution, something that's not open to question.
That's part of the sacred, I think.
Okay. Now, that constellation of ideas is often called orthodoxy. So rather, which originated as a religious idea, but it has a long history of being used in political contexts. So orthodoxy, binary, shows up in George Orwell's 1984. It's actually discussed and theorized in that novel. So rather than going to say this is religion, I think we can talk about orthodoxies in religious context and political context and others, academic context, art context, etc., without having to make the move, let's adopt a particular, somewhat arbitrary definition of religion in order to explain the phenomenon.
I see. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I guess I was using, I'm not an expert on defining religion, although I, read it at random in the field. You're suggesting that in a way I was interpreting religion too narrowly by identifying it with orthodoxy, and that there's a way of, and that it'd be more helpful to think about religion as a set of beliefs and practices where there is an openness to questioning and diversity of interpretation.
No, actually I'm suggesting that the question you're trying to answer, which is can we understand politics better by comparing it with religion and seeing it as religion, might be better answered if we think about orthodoxy as the working category instead of the category of religion.
That could be. Yeah. I'm not sure. It would be maybe exaggerated to call this a work in progress. It's just a set of thoughts which I'd like to develop further with, and these comments are very helpful. I'm not sure. It does seem to me there's something going on. Maybe it's been going on if some of these quotations are right, certainly since Walter Lippmann made these observations in the 1920s, but, and indeed much earlier. You can find much earlier skepticism about the rational voter, or back to the 19th century.
Indeed.
It seems to me that we have we've got to try and understand all the various ways in which voters are not rational in the sense of the folk theory. And my thought is religion, however we're going to understand it, is going to be helpful as a lens to try to make sense of this. And as I said, I just don't think the concept of identity helps. Sacredness, I guess, does. And with the qualification that Dan makes, in some way, some version of counterintuitiveness and hyperbolic, whatever the word is, exaggeration of categories also is. One person who read this paper before I came here said, isn't it all just a matter of interests? Weren't the Trump voters and the Brexit voters basically just expressing their interests? I think the answer to that has to be no.
I would agree with you there. Yes.
So does religion help, is my question, however we're going to understand it.
Right. We were never intended to reach definitive answers which you could wave around as you left this room. We've had some very, very interesting reflections, some most suggestive suggestions and possible ideas to think of. And I hope that this will be helpful in you developing these thoughts that you presented to us. Thank you very, very much indeed again. Thank you very much.